Emperor Francis and Empress Maria Theresa of Austria presided over a vast dominion in Central Europe. Maria Theresa, who had inherited the throne from her father, governed with notable resolve and authority, shaping policy and overseeing the complex machinery of the Habsburg state. On the night of November 2, 1755, the Empress laid aside her reports and state papers as labour pains made further work impossible. In the imperial palace at Vienna, she gave birth to a daughter, Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna. Emperor Francis formally announced the arrival of the new archduchess to the assembled court, adding another member to an already extensive royal household. Maria Antonia grew up surrounded by archdukes and archduchesses, 4 brothers and 7 sisters, with yet another brother arriving the following year. By tradition, all imperial daughters bore the name Maria as their first name, but within the family they were known by their second names. Thus, Maria Antonia was simply called Antonia. The rhythm of family life followed the seasons. Winters were spent in the city palace at the heart of Vienna. In spring and summer, the court relocated to a vast palace 5 miles away, adorned with mirrors, painted ceilings and rich tapestries, and offering numerous rooms for each child. The estate lay within a 500-acre park of gardens and forests, and even included a small menagerie with a camel, a puma and several rhinoceroses, a display of wealth, curiosity and imperial reach. Although Austria nominally had both an emperor and an empress, it was Maria Theresa who truly governed. Francis supported her, but the burden of the rule rested largely on her shoulders. Too occupied with affairs of state to raise her children personally, she appointed governesses to care for them and tutors to guide their education. As members of the ruling dynasty, the archdukes and archduchesses enjoyed a privileged existence. They rode horses, hunted across the estates, and, in the harsh Austrian winters, glided over the snow in sleighs carved in the shape of swans. Antonia herself preferred the freedom of the palace gardens to the discipline of her lessons. She possessed a remarkable singing voice and often performed in family concerts, while her brothers and sisters played instruments, an early sign of the artistic culture that surrounded Europe's great courts. In 1762, when Antonia was 6, the imperial family received a young prodigy, whose name would echo through history, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. He was the same age as Antonia, and already recognized as an extraordinary musician. Accounts from the time describe a brief incident on the polished palace floors that brought the children face to face, a small moment that later generations would weave into the larger story of both lives. 3 years later, in August 1765, Emperor Francis died. Antonia was only 9. Maria Theresa, now ruling with the assistance of her eldest son Joseph, turned her attention to a crucial task for any dynastic house in the 18th century, arranging powerful political marriages for her daughters. In this world, royal unions were instruments of diplomacy. Couples did not marry for personal affection. They married to secure alliances, manage rivalries and stabilize borders, particularly in times of war. The Empress focused on a strategic objective. She wished to marry one of her daughters to Louis Auguste, the future King of France. Austria and France had long been adversaries, but at this moment they were at peace. Maria Theresa believed that a marriage between the Habsburgs and the Bourbons would help solidify that fragile equilibrium. Antonia, close in age to the young French Dauphin, became the most suitable candidate. When the French court agreed, preparations for Antonia's new role began in earnest. A ballet master trained her to move with greater grace, fitting for a future French princess. A French dental specialist corrected her crooked teeth with wires, and a Parisian hairdresser introduced her to the latest styles from Versailles. Every detail of her appearance was treated as a matter of state. In 1768, France sent a tutor, Abbé de Vermont, to the imperial court. He observed that the 13-year-old archduchess possessed a naturally elegant presence, with blue eyes, blonde hair and delicate features. Yet he quickly discovered that her formal education was weak. Previous tutors had indulged her and allowed her studies to drift. Vermont imposed a stricter program. Antonia began to study religion, French literature, French history and the French language with new seriousness, gradually transforming from a carefree archduchess into a young woman prepared to become the future Princess of France. The next decisive chapter opened in April 1770. On the 15th of that month, official wedding ceremonies commenced in Vienna. The French ambassador arrived to represent the royal family at Versailles, who remained in France. Over several days, the Austrian imperial court hosted banquets, balls, and elaborate receptions in honour of the young archduchess whose life was about to change. A formal ceremony was held to symbolise her marriage to Louis Auguste, even though her future husband stayed in France. From this point forward, Antonia was known by her French name, Marie Antoinette. On the cold morning of April 21st, she stepped into a golden carriage to begin her journey. Mother and daughter parted, aware that great distance and political duty would now separate them. The procession that accompanied her, 57 carriages in all, moved slowly across Central Europe towards Strasbourg on the French frontier. The trip lasted more than 2 weeks, with long days of travel and only brief periods of rest. Her attendants did what they could to maintain her comfort. At night, the party lodged in monasteries and palaces. Hosts arranged concerts, performances, and formal receptions at each stop. Local crowds gathered to see the young Dauphine, the future Queen of France. Although she was often exhausted, Marie Antoinette was expected to appear serene, gracious and composed, a living symbol of alliance between two great powers. At last, the carriages reached the Rhine, the great river that marked the border between Austria and France. There, on an island in midstream, a special pavilion had been constructed and lavishly furnished with carpets, tapestries, and borrowed pieces from wealthy families in the region. In this symbolic space, she left the Austrian side of her life behind. She entered as an Archduchess of Austria and emerged on the French side to meet the attendants who would serve her at the court of Versailles. The city of Strasbourg greeted her with ringing church bells and fireworks that lit the sky. Young girls scattered flowers along her path, and she gathered them as she passed, an image of youthful grace presented to a watching population. From Strasbourg, another procession of carriages carried her approximately 250 miles deeper into France, to a quiet forest road where King Louis XV and his grandson waited. There, Marie Antoinette stepped down from her carriage, presented herself to the king, and was formally received into the French royal family. Louis XV, still commanding and dignified, offered her a warm welcome. By contrast, the Dauphin, Louis Auguste, appeared reserved, awkward and shy. The two young strangers, brought together by diplomacy rather than choice, now stood on the threshold of marriage. On the morning of May 16, 1770, Marie Antoinette arrived at the Palace of Versailles for her wedding day. She had little time to absorb the scale and splendour of her new home, with its vast halls, glittering mirrors, and formal gardens before the preparations began. Attendants presented her with costly gifts from the king, including jewels, pearls, a diamond fan and bracelets engraved with her initials. Her hair and gown required hours of careful work, a ritual of transformation that reflected the expectations of the French court. Clad in a white gown, she joined the Dauphin, who was dressed in gold, and together they proceeded through the palace to the royal chapel. There, in front of the assembled court, they were united in marriage, sealing the alliance between Austria and France. Around 6,000 guests watched as the royal family and their new daughter-in-law celebrated at a grand banquet in the recently completed opera house at Versailles. Outside the palace, food was handed out in the streets, and water in some fountains was replaced with wine, a dramatic gesture of royal generosity. For 2 weeks, acrobatic performances, masked balls, and fireworks filled the days and nights. Across France, people marked the union of the young couple. It was within this atmosphere of celebration and expectation that Versailles itself took on renewed significance. The palace stood as one of the most extraordinary expressions of royal power in Europe. Its halls shimmered with gold and marble, and thousands of arched windows reflected the light that poured across its vast facade. Ceilings and walls were covered with paintings, while sculptures and tapestries lined corridor after corridor. Beyond the palace itself stretched gardens of remarkable scale, where fountains, groves and terraces framed the expansive Grand Canal, a single feature within more than 2,000 acres of carefully designed landscape. For centuries, French monarchs had resided in Paris. Their principal home was the Tuileries Palace near the heart of the capital. That tradition changed when Louis XIV moved his court to the village of Versailles in 1682. From that moment, Versailles became not only the residence of the king and his family, but also the centre of political life in France. Ministers, courtiers, and members of the nobility all lived within its orbit. On any given day, nearly 10,000 people moved through its halls. Visitors from across Europe travelled to see it, and even purchased keepsakes in its courtyard, treating the palace as both a seat of government and a spectacle of royal grandeur. Within this immense structure, Marie Antoinette occupied her own suite of rooms. She had spaces for guards, public ceremonies, household attendants, and a private bedroom. Although she had been raised in imperial courts, nothing had prepared her for the constant attention demanded by life at Versailles. Every movement, gesture, and habit was performed under observation, guided by traditions that shaped court behaviour in every detail. Daily life followed an exact schedule. Marie Antoinette typically rose between 9 and 10. On many mornings, she took her breakfast while bathing, dressed in a flannel gown for modesty. This ritual marked the beginning of the lever, the formal process of preparing the future queen for the day. It drew an audience of nobles and, unusually, members of the public who were allowed to attend if properly dressed. After the initial stages, the men withdrew, and her attendants completed her preparations before an audience of women. Once dressed, she attended Catholic Mass in the royal chapel. The afternoon brought a public meal with her husband, observed as if it were a theatrical presentation. She then paid visits to the Dauphin or to the three aunts of King Louis XV, followed by lessons with her tutor, Vermond. Her evenings included music instruction, dinner at 9, and finally the coucher, the formal ceremony of retiring for the night. Like the lever, this too was open to spectators. Only at 11 was she allowed true privacy. Despite the grandeur of her surroundings, Marie Antoinette felt isolated. Her small dog, Mops, was eventually brought to Versailles, in hopes of easing her loneliness, but the pressures of court life outweighed such comforts. Her husband's aunts were strict and disapproving, and her attendants often corrected even minor missteps. Many courtiers regarded her with suspicion because she was Austrian, a sentiment that followed her at every turn. She also had to adjust to life with her new husband. Although similar in age, their personalities could not have been more different. Marie Antoinette was spirited and sociable, drawn to conversation, music, and gatherings. Louis Auguste was reserved, awkward, and often melancholy. He preferred solitude, hunting, and study. Their contrasting natures only increased her feelings of confinement within the palace. From afar, her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, remained a powerful presence in her life. Through Count Mercy, the Austrian ambassador, and through Vermond, she received reports of her daughter's behaviour. Marie Antoinette trusted both men, unaware at first that every detail they shared found its way back to Vienna. Her mother's letters were firm and unrelenting, urging her to focus more on her husband and less on social pleasures. The young Dauphine respected her mother deeply, yet she lived with the constant weight of her expectations. In June 1773, life at court shifted. After 3 years of marriage, Marie Antoinette was officially presented to the people of Paris. Her ceremonial entry into the capital was greeted with trumpets, cannon fire, and cheering crowds. The governor handed the royal couple the keys to the city. The warmth of the welcome left a lasting impression on her, particularly the joy shown by the poor who viewed the young couple with hope. Many believed that the next reign might bring relief from hardship. The following year, events took a dramatic turn. In the spring of 1774, King Louis XV fell ill with smallpox. The disease advanced rapidly, and within 2 weeks he was dead. His grandson, Louis Auguste, now ascended the throne. He was crowned Louis XV on June 11, 1775. Marie Antoinette, just 19, witnessed the moment with deep emotion. The new king was 20 years old. French law granted queens no political authority. Marie Antoinette's formal role was to set an example of grace, piety, and good conduct. She was expected to obey her husband and to bear children who would secure the future of the Bourbon line. Yet political expectations surrounded her nonetheless. The Empress in Vienna hoped her daughter would influence French policy and protect the delicate alliance between Austria and France. Marie Antoinette, however, longed to shape her life according to her own wishes. She felt constrained by tradition and weary of her mother's demands. As queen, she possessed the freedom to enjoy the privileges of Versailles, and she embraced them fully. Her household was immense. Nearly 500 people served her in various capacities. She had attendants who dressed her, others who managed her meals, and men assigned to her horses. One individual's sole responsibility was to carry the long train of her gown. At Versailles, fashion was a powerful instrument of status, and Marie Antoinette soon led the trends. Her dressmaker, Mademoiselle Rose Bertin, visited twice each week, creating elaborate gowns of satin, velvet, and brocade. These garments were adorned with jewels, pearls, ribbons, and lace. Her wardrobe filled 3 rooms. Jewelers presented her with new designs, and she delighted particularly in diamonds, owning earrings as ornate as the chandeliers of the palace. Her stylist, Léonard Autier, elevated her appearance even further. Wigs had long symbolized noble rank, but under the Queen's influence they reached unprecedented heights. The towering pouf became her signature. Some were decorated with miniature pastoral scenes or mechanical birds, while others commemorated events such as naval victories with tiny ships perched above her curls. She even adopted whimsical themes, including arrangements of vegetables carved from fabric and ornaments. However impractical these creations were, the court quickly imitated her. The poufs were striking but cumbersome. Their size blocked views in theatres, pressed against the ceilings of carriages and made sleep difficult. Wrapped and padded at night, they created warm spaces that attracted insects such as lice. Women often used slim tools to scratch their scalps beneath the heavy structure. Surrounded by a circle of youthful friends, Marie Antoinette filled her nights with activities. She hosted weekly masked balls, organised hunts, played cards and billiards, and attended gatherings in Paris. The king often retired early, leaving the Queen and her companions to their festivities. Her disregard for the solemn traditions of the court offended many noble families, who believed she treated her position too lightly. Beyond the palace walls, public criticism intensified. Rumours and satirical songs circulated widely, targeting her clothing, her hairstyles, and her spending. Her retreat to a smaller residence, the Petit Trianon, a gift from Louis XV in 1775, only deepened resentment. Many viewed it as a symbol of her desire to escape the responsibilities of queenship. Yet despite the growing disapproval, Marie Antoinette continued to live according to her own impulses. Within the gilded world of Versailles, she remained determined to shape her life as she saw fit, convinced that her status allowed her a freedom that few around her believed she should exercise. That sense of independence soon collided with another expectation that defined her role as queen. All across France, expectations rested heavily on Marie Antoinette. The Bourbon dynasty required a male heir who would secure the future of the throne. As the years passed without a child, disappointment spread among the French people, and concern deepened within her own family. Empress Maria Theresa continued to exert pressure from Vienna, sending stern letters and eventually dispatching her son, Emperor Joseph, to Versailles to advise and admonish his sister. Joseph arrived in April 1777 and remained for 6 weeks. During his stay, he criticised Marie Antoinette's intimate circle of friends, her taste for elaborate hairstyles and cosmetics, and her fondness for gambling. His visit underlined how closely her private life had become a matter of dynastic and political importance. Relief finally came when Marie Antoinette became pregnant. On December 20th, 1778, the royal family and a large gathering of witnesses filled her chambers as the young queen, at 23, gave birth. The long-awaited child was not a son but a daughter, Marie-Thérèse, later known as Madame Royale. Many observers were disappointed that no heir to the throne had arrived. Yet for Marie Antoinette, this first child held deep personal meaning. She later expressed the belief that a son would have belonged to the state, while a daughter felt entirely her own. At the same time, events far beyond Versailles were reshaping the world. Across the Atlantic, the American colonies had declared independence from Britain and were fighting in the American Revolution. King Louis XV: "I chose to support the American cause, both to weaken Britain and to influence the balance of power." This decision drew France into war and required vast financial resources. While noble officers crossed the ocean to fight, the cost of intervention placed an increasing strain on the French treasury and left little relief for the poor at home. Amid this shifting political landscape, Marie Antoinette concentrated on her role as a mother and sought a more secluded life. Her clothing grew simpler. She favoured plain white gowns tied with ribbons, wore her hair more naturally, and often sheltered it beneath a straw hat. On the grounds of the Petit Trianon, she created an idealised rural retreat, a small model village with a farmhouse, barn, mill, chicken coop and scattered cottages. Cows, sheep, goats, and poultry completed the scene. The entire setting was carefully designed to appear old and authentic. A farmer, gardeners, and cowherds were employed to maintain the illusion of rustic simplicity. Marie Antoinette and her circle enjoyed this carefully staged version of country life, even as real peasants across France continued to struggle with hunger and hardship. As the Queen spent more time away from the main palace, rumours multiplied. Nobles who were not invited to the Petit Trianon felt excluded and resentful. Many observers criticised her for abandoning traditional French silk in favour of other fabrics, seeing it as an insult to national industry. More broadly, resentment focused on her spending. Although generations of royals had lived extravagantly, a growing number of French subjects blamed Marie Antoinette personally for what they perceived as waste of funds that should have served the kingdom and its people. Public opinion softened when, on October 22, 1781, Marie Antoinette gave birth to a son, Louis Joseph. She had finally produced a dauphin, the long-awaited male heir to the Bourbon line. All of France celebrated this moment, which appeared to confirm stability for the monarchy. Yet for the Queen, there was a private sorrow. Her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, had died at the end of 1780 and never witnessed her daughter's fulfilment of this dynastic duty. The royal succession grew even more secure on March 27, 1785, when another son, Louis Charles, was born. With two male heirs, Marie Antoinette had fully met the expectations set before her as queen. Nonetheless, the renewed approval of the French people would prove fragile and short-lived. Despite her devotion to her children, hostility toward Marie Antoinette continued to grow. In the summer of 1785, a scandal erupted that damaged her reputation beyond repair. It became known as the affair of the diamond necklace. A jeweller who supplied the royal court approached the Queen, expecting payment for an enormous and costly diamond necklace. Marie Antoinette denied any knowledge of the order. He claimed he had already delivered the piece to Cardinal Louis de Rohan, a prominent church official who was supposed to present it to her. In reality, the Queen had never requested such a necklace. Convinced that the cardinal was involved in a plot to humiliate her, she urged the king to have him arrested. During the subsequent trial, a more complex scheme emerged. A woman at court had forged a message in the Queen's name to obtain the necklace through Cardinal Rohan. When he handed it over, believing he was serving Marie Antoinette, the woman instead passed it to her husband, who went to London and sold the diamonds. The court eventually found Cardinal Rohan innocent. Although he was cleared, Marie Antoinette was dissatisfied with the decision, and Louis XV. "I removed the cardinal from court." Many nobles who supported Rohan were outraged. Even though the Queen had never ordered the necklace, the public largely blamed her for the entire scandal. The incident reinforced the image of a frivolous, manipulative queen, and dismissing a man judged to be innocent seemed to confirm the worst fears of her critics. Personal tragedies soon deepened her troubles. In July 1786, she gave birth to another daughter, who died the following summer. Her eldest son, Louis Joseph, suffered from serious illness, and his health steadily declined. Meanwhile, the French state itself was in crisis. The cost of assisting the American Revolution, combined with the long-standing extravagance of the royal court, severely weakened the national finances. Anger spread among the population. Many people directed their frustration at Marie Antoinette, whom they saw as the symbol of royal excess. Pamphlets and leaflets circulated with hostile stories about her. Satirical drawings mocked her and portrayed her as the source of France's misery. She was booed in public and encountered written threats near her usual seat in the theatre. Nature added to the country's distress. In the summer of 1788, disastrous weather destroyed harvests, reducing the supply of grain. Bread prices climbed across France as wheat grew scarce. A harsh winter followed, leaving the poor cold and hungry. Under these conditions, many subjects began to question how the king, queen, and nobility could continue to hold elaborate gatherings and dine on rich food, while ordinary people struggled to survive. Spring brought no real relief. On June 4, 1789, the ailing Louis Joseph died, and his younger brother, Louis Charles, became the new Dauphin. The loss struck the royal family at the very moment when the political order was beginning to unravel. Under growing pressure, Louis XV. I summoned the Estates General in May 1789. This assembly represented the three traditional orders of French society: the nobility, the clergy, and the common people, the latter known as the Third Estate. In practice, each estate held one vote, which allowed the privileged orders to outvote the majority population. The assembly failed to agree on meaningful reforms. Frustrated by this imbalance, members of the Third Estate broke away. Inspired in part by the example of the American Revolution, they formed the National Assembly and claimed the authority to make laws in the name of the people. Louis XV and Marie Antoinette hoped to preserve the monarchy and the king's authority, yet events were moving beyond their control. Although the king allowed the new body to meet, he also concentrated troops around Paris, which many perceived as a threat. Fear and uncertainty swept through the capital. On July 14, 1789, crowds confronted royal forces and attacked the Bastille, a fortress prison that symbolized absolute monarchy. The insurgents seized weapons and gunpowder, released a small number of prisoners and left many dead and wounded behind. The uprising spread quickly to the countryside, where peasants assaulted manor houses and targeted noble landlords. The National Assembly began to draft the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a foundational text that echoed the spirit of the American Declaration of Independence. It declared equal rights for all men, regardless of status, and laid the groundwork for a new constitutional order intended to give broader representation to the nation. As revolutionary ideas advanced, relations between the royal court at Versailles and the people of Paris deteriorated. Mutual suspicion intensified. The king and queen feared for their safety and believed that their every move was watched. Many Parisians suspected that the royal family was plotting with foreign powers to crush the new movement and restore absolute rule. Tension reached a critical point on October 5, 1789. In Paris, market women, servants, and washerwomen, alarmed by rising bread prices and the hunger of their children, gathered and began a march through cold rain toward Versailles. Units of the National Guard followed, hoping to keep order. Nearly 6,000 people, many armed with pikes, sticks, brooms, and a few pistols, advanced on the palace. Exhausted and covered in mud, the women demanded that the king ensure the supply of food. A small delegation was admitted, and Louis XV agreed to provide grain for Paris. Outside, however, anger continued to mount. The situation remained volatile as day turned to night. Uncertain how to respond and assuming that the royal guard would protect them, Louis XV and Marie Antoinette eventually retired to their rooms. Before dawn, a group of intruders forced their way into the palace. Several of them reached the Queen's apartments and killed 2 of her guards. In the aftermath of the attack, the king appeared on a balcony to address the crowd, but the demonstrators insisted on seeing the Queen herself. Marie Antoinette stepped forward alone to face the shouting masses, standing in silent acknowledgement before them. The demand of the crowd was clear. They wanted the king and queen to relocate to Paris and end the symbolic distance between the royal family in Versailles and the people they governed. The royal household had no real choice. Under escort, Louis XV, Marie Antoinette, Madame Royale, and the young Dauphin were taken from Versailles in a long, slow procession. Many in the crowd carried pikes bearing the severed heads of the slain guards, a grim reminder of the violence that had occurred. The royal family left their magnificent palace behind, not knowing that they would never again return to live there. Their departure marked a turning point in the revolution, for the move to Paris placed the monarchy under the constant gaze of the nation. After the march on Versailles, the king, the queen, and their household were taken to Paris and installed in the Tuileries Palace. There, Louis XV and Marie Antoinette continued many of the formal customs that had defined life at Versailles. The public ceremonies of waking, dressing, and retiring for the night continued. Daily mass remained a central ritual. Crowds still gathered to watch these routines, a reminder that even in captivity, the monarchy remained on display. Within the city, political change accelerated. The Assembly debated the creation of a constitutional monarchy, a system in which the king would share authority with elected officials. France stood at a crossroads, and the population would now choose its representatives. Marie Antoinette watched with sorrow as her husband gradually conceded power. Louis XV, I grew withdrawn and depressed, burdened by the knowledge that he was losing control of the nation he was sworn to lead. Although the royal family still lived in a palace and maintained the appearance of rank, they understood that their safety was uncertain. Hostility toward them grew each day, and rumours of violence circulated through Paris. Fear began to shape their decisions. Quietly, the king and queen agreed that escape was their only chance for survival. On June 20th, 1791, they carried out their attempt. The day unfolded as usual, masking their intentions. That night, Marie Antoinette and the children's governess escorted 12-year-old Madame Royale and 6-year-old Louis Charles to a waiting carriage. When the palace grew quiet, the king and queen disguised themselves as servants and slipped into the darkness. Outside the city, the family transferred to a larger carriage equipped for a long journey. The governess posed as a Russian noblewoman, while the rest of the family acted as her servants. Their destination was a town near the French border, where they hoped loyal supporters would protect them. Progress was slow. At regular intervals, the horses had to be changed. For a time, it appeared that no one suspected their flight. That illusion ended when they were recognized in a small village. Word spread ahead of them, and by the time they reached the next relay station, the local population blocked their path. Officials from the National Assembly arrived the next morning and ordered their return to Paris. The journey back was grueling. Heat and dust filled the air, and the family moved at a crawl while crowds gathered to shout insults. What had taken a single day on their escape took 4 days in defeat. Once returned to the Tuileries, they found themselves more closely watched than ever. On September 14, 1791, Louis XV. I formally accepted the constitution crafted by the new government. It established a legislative assembly and sharply restricted his authority. That day, the king wept, knowing he had lost much of the power once held by the French monarchy. Marie Antoinette, however, refused to surrender hope. Throughout the winter, she wrote secretly to royal allies across Europe. She used codes and invisible ink, hiding letters in hats and boxes of chocolates to smuggle them out of the palace. She appealed to her brother Leopold in Austria and to leaders in Prussia, Spain, Sweden and Russia. Before long, Austria and Prussia declared war on France, determined to restore the monarchy and remove the assembly from power. In France, anger toward the royal family intensified. On August 10, 1792, an armed mob stormed the Tuileries. They tore through the royal apartments, killed guards and servants, and looted the family's possessions. Marie Antoinette's clothes and jewellery were seized, and the palace was left in ruins. The royal family hid in a secure chamber inside the assembly building, but by nightfall they were prisoners. Their fate, and the fate of the monarchy, was now in the hands of the revolution. The family was moved to the Temple Tower, a medieval fortress in Paris. Their new life bore little resemblance to their past. The king and his son lodged on the second floor. Marie Antoinette, Madame Royale and Princess Elizabeth occupied the third floor, which included a single bathroom. They shared simple meals, taught the children their lessons, walked briefly in the garden and spent evenings reading or sewing. Even under guard, they remained surrounded by a few loyal servants who tended to their basic needs. While they lived under close surveillance, France underwent profound political change. The newly formed National Convention abolished the monarchy and declared the nation a republic. There was no longer a place for a king in the new government. Louis XV. I was placed on trial for treason. Accused of acting against the interests of France, he was sentenced to death. On January 20, 1793, Louis XV. I said his final farewell to his family. The next morning, Marie Antoinette heard the distant drums and the shouts of the crowd. She knew the execution had taken place. Over the following months, the family was torn apart. In July, officials separated Louis Charles from his mother and confined him alone under the watch of a harsh guardian. In August, Marie Antoinette herself was removed from the temple and transferred to a new prison, where 2 soldiers monitored her constantly in her small cell. Her trial began in October 1793, 4 years after she had left Versailles. Time and hardship had altered her greatly. At 37, she appeared older, frail, and visibly worn. Her dress was patched, her hair grey. She faced accusations that she had conspired against France, spied for Austria, and influenced the king's decisions to the nation's detriment. None of these charges were proven, but the public wanted a culprit for the suffering that had overtaken the country. The execution of the king had not been enough. The queen, too, was condemned. She was sentenced to death. Early the next morning, Marie Antoinette wrote a final letter to her sister-in-law, Princess Elizabeth, expressing love for her children and sorrow at leaving them behind. The letter never reached its intended recipient. On October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette was taken from her cell. Her hands were tied and her hair was cut. She was placed in an open cart and transported through Paris, surrounded by armed guards and crowds eager to witness the spectacle. The streets were muddy and the journey was slow. Upon reaching the public square, she climbed the scaffold unaided. Moments later, the blade of the guillotine fell. The executioner held her head aloft as the crowd shouted in triumph. Her body and head were taken away. The French Revolution did not end with her death. In the years that followed, the new government fell into deep division. From 1793 to 1794, thousands were executed during the period known as the Reign of Terror, including Princess Elizabeth herself. The turmoil finally subsided when Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power in 1799. He reorganized France, expanded its territories, and was eventually crowned emperor. The young Dauphin, Louis Charles, remained in the Temple Tower until he died in June 1794 at the age of 9. Only Madame Royale survived. On her 17th birthday, she was released and sent to Austria, returning to the land where her mother's life had begun, and where it had first been shaped by destiny.